So this will be the introductory lecture for session 3 of the first unit of POA English 11, which deals with the literature of the colonial period. The colonial period begins with the arrival of settlers in Jamestown and then Plymouth in the early 1600s and ends somewhere in the mid 1700s as we move from the colonial era, where everyone is still happily British with no problems, into the revolutionary era, where we begin to see conflict um, between the colonies and the mother country. The definitive portion of the country for the colonial period, the one that is American in some fashion that differentiates them from what the various colonies had left behind in Europe, is New England. The Puritans came, they were a minority in England. They were initially, and a minority here, only 27 out of 100 and something people on the Mayflower were actually covenant members of this church. And so the society that they established was very different from anything that had ever been seen before. The closest was during Cromwell's period, but even then you had the militarism, you had Parliament, you had um, Cromwell himself as Lord Protector during the later years. So in the beginning, you have first the separatists, the Plymouth Bay Colony, led by William Bradford, among others. And they left England. They felt like the Church of England was corrupt beyond saving, and so they left to do something different. In Holland, they found that pursuing trades where they couldn't farm made them unhappy, and frankly, the sheer freedom and diversity of faith in Holland was threatening to what they wanted to establish, which was a specific community that would be true and faithful to what they believed. And so they came to the Americas where they could be alone. Um, the Plymouth Bay Colony, while not as radical, excuse me, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, while not as radical as the Plymouth Bay Colony, the separatists that we call the Pilgrims, also came for religious reasons. They wanted the chance to establish a religious community separate from the religious rancor of Europe. Now, ironically, in defense of their own ability to worship freely, these pilgrims and the members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony initially denied anyone else the right to practice their religion freely. As time goes on, though, New England does become the source of our very first laws supporting religious freedom. And as the population grows, the kind of strict controls that were initially tolerated as a way of forcing unity, of making everybody work together, putting the community first, uh, seemed to become unnecessary. And really, the community could survive without quite so much strict obedience. And so you see all throughout New England record of second churches and things being formed in communities, which are an indication of some dissent, some disagreement. Eventually, you have Rhode Island is formed and is formed in part on the basis of religious freedom. And as the time period continues, as John Smith said down in Jamestown, you can make a lot of money here and you can make it easily. And this was true. They were doing very well for themselves. You had poor like everywhere else, but the opportunity to succeed was tremendous. And so many people continued to pour into America. Um, One textbook I consulted in preparing this said that Philadelphia was second only to London as a center of commerce by this time. That's amazing for a colonial city like this. In any case, the arrival of more and more people from more and more places with more and more faiths and the loosening of strict community ties as life became easier in the Americas led to a gradual secularizing of New England. This kind of had to take place if more than one religion was going to live there. And if those multiple religions, since more than one religion was going to live there, and since the people had to find a way to live in peace, they had to secularize enough to allow religious freedom and to ease up the theocratic nature of the original colonial governments. Um, Out of this greater breadth uh, of thinking, you have some other forces that push for secularization as well. You have the Enlightenment and simply the tremendous business success of the community. More and more people were coming because of that financial success, with that as their goal, and religion as a side note. And the Enlightenment did challenge certain traditional ideas, especially um, the worldview of the Puritans, which was so profoundly allegorical, where everything was symbolic of, indicative of biblical conflict between good and evil. We have a number of pieces here that represent these different periods. Through the three prose pieces are all nonfiction and are all rhetorical to some extent. They're all making arguments. The first comes from the early religious idealistic period and is John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity. A Model of Christian Charity was first given as a sermon on the boat on the way to Massachusetts Bay. John Winthrop was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it echoes a theme we'll look at over and over again in this course about the balance between the rights of the community and the rights of the individual. Winthrop was heavily on the side of the community, um, although they were pulling away from the strict class boundaries of England, where you were born noble. And he said, you know, you're always going to have some rich, you're always going to have some poor, but everybody has to be okay and everybody has to pull together. And we have to, and his means for doing this was for everyone to belong to the church and to have Christian charity, or the pure love of Christ, with the goal of bringing the whole community together. And so he strongly emphasized the community over the individual, in part because he says that while the community will survive the loss of an individual, the individual who goes out on their own in America won't survive on their own. They need the community to make it. Um, the second prose piece is by Roger Williams and comes later in the process of the growth of New England. By the time Roger Williams writes this piece, which is called The Bloody Tenant of Persecution, we have seen Rhode Island form, primarily from people kicked out of other colonies for believing the wrong stuff. And Roger Williams is calling powerfully for religious freedom. He makes many arguments that we hear today in favor of religious freedom. And he calls his piece The Bloody Tenant of Persecution, which is the name he gives to the principle he's arguing against, of religious intolerance and forced belief. Finally, representing the late colonial period and the transition through the Enlightenment and on toward the Revolutionary era, we have Benjamin Franklin, who is a perfect model of Enlightenment rationalism. He was a deist, which is to say he believed in God, but not the traditional, but was unsure of the traditional Christianity. He was ultra rational. If we look at his writings, they're always very practical, very philosophical. They are wise, but it's a common sense wisdom. It's not a difficult philosophical tract that you have to study forever to understand. It's a very simple, straightforward manner. He uses a lot of humor to make his points. He was a very witty, clever writer and communicator. And we know Franklin was something of a Renaissance man, a scientist, an inventor, a businessman, a public servant, a politician. He started the first fire department. He started the first lending library. It was amazing what this man did. And then, of course, he goes on to have a tremendous role in the revolution as well. And from Franklin, we have an essay called A Way to Wealth, which was introduction to a later edition of his Poor Richard's Almanac. And it demonstrates the wit, the humor, the rationalism, the practicality, the optimism, all of it, all of these qualities of the good New England squire in the late colonial period. There isn't any fiction from New England during this time, at least not that we've kept. And if any was written, it was very, very little until very late in the era, because the Puritans found fiction to be a waste of time. It wasn't true, which they had problems with ethically. They found it religiously dubious because fiction meant you were making something up, and so they just didn't write much. So as far as traditional literature, fiction, poetry, drama, we have two poets. They both fit in with the religious Puritan tradition, although they are very, very different. Edward Taylor, who was totally unknown in his lifetime, and his poems were discovered after his death, writes beautiful, very intricate, very philosophically complex, metrical, devotional poetry, which is to say, all of his poems have subjects like the poems in the book of Psalms. They are all in praise of God or explicitly about religious ideas. And there's no indication of who wrote them or anything in the poems themselves. No personal details, no specifics of the exact world around him, only generalities of the life he lived and expressions of religious faith. They are beautifully written. Anne Bradstreet is a major Puritan poet, and she's also the first female writer to be published and gain recognition in American literature. She writes poetry that, as a religious person, contains a religious worldview and often has that feeling to it. She's dead before the turn of the 18th century, so she lives entirely in the religious era, the religious period of the colonial era. And so it's not surprising that that was so central to her. What is different about her poetry is the amount of personal detail and personal feelings that she puts into it. She's willing to express doubts, or at least to admit that she has them in writing her poems. She writes about her own husband and her love for him. She writes about her house that burned down. She writes about nature and the world around her and how she sees God in that. And so she's reaching out to subjects, and because she's a religious person, there are religious tones to it, but she's not necessarily writing devotional poetry, poetry that reads like hymns or like psalms, which is itself unique among Puritan writings. So there you go. That's our period. That'll get you through this week. And then when you finish this, you finish the first unit, and you'll be ready to go on to the next unit, which is on the writing in the Revolutionary Era.